Today we're talking about one of the original G.I. Joes, debuting in 1982, and yet somebody who's been used surprisingly little in G.I. Joe lore, but who has some of the most names and code names in all of G.I. Joe. Yep, today is all about Short-Fuze. Eric Freistadt from Chicago, Illinois was born into a family of career soldiers. In fact, both his father and grandfather were career top sergeants before they retired. So Eric too followed that path when he was old enough. For some reason, Eric's name was changed to Mark Branston in 1983, and then 3 years later it was again changed to combine both of those name versions, and he became Mark W. Freistadt. But because we focus on comic book stories here, and he's listed as Eric Freistadt in G.I. Joe Order of Battle and throughout the Real American Hero Homoverse, we'll stick with his Eric name. But what do you call him? Let me know in the comments below. So when he was old enough, Eric or Mark or whatever joined the U.S. Army and went through basic and then AIT. His file cards say his primary MOS is artillery, with a secondary as an infantry engineer. With his mortar, I would have expected him to be 11 Charlie, 11C, an indirect fire infantryman who would have received this training at Fort Benning, but we'll go with the file card data, which means Eric went to U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill. It's there that he learned how to integrate all fires and influence the entire battlefield by coordinating joint fire from ground elements, close air support, UAVs, attack helicopters, and even longer range missiles and rockets. Mortar fires excel at complementing heavy artillery, naval bombardment, CAS, and small munitions from ground elements. They also excel at providing both direct and indirect fire to suppress an enemy, force them into a certain area, or force them to disperse, as well as forcing armored vehicles to button up, which essentially reduces their lethality. They can bridge the gap between the assault force's attacks and field artillery's reloads. Their high alpha trajectory makes them good to hit enemy targets behind walls, in ravines, on reverse slopes, and even things like alleyways and fortified structures along streets and sidewalks if you're conducting military operations on urban terrain. A combat environment that favors high rates of fire, short range, and steep angles of fall. For the 81 Mike ammunition that Eric comes with, you're looking at 25 to 30 rounds per minute for 2 minutes, then about 8 to 15 rounds per minute sustained. He's learned how to launch all types of munitions, downrange from high explosives to smoke for obscuration to illumination to bunker busters and even laser or GPS guided rounds. You have the 60mm M224 light mortar, the 81mm M29A1 and M252 medium mortars, and the 170mm M30 and the 120mm M120 heavy mortars. His file card says he comes with the M181 Mike medium mortar, even though that was phased out in the early 1950s for the M29. He'd also have trained on the 60mm M2 mortar, the M224 60mm lightweight company mortar system, and these days he'd likely be working on the XM905 AMPS, that's Advanced Mortar Protection System, which fires 120mm mortar rounds. It's essentially a dismounted version of the recoilless mortar systems used on the M1129 MCV used in Stryker Brigade combat teams, whose 120mm mortar is based on the one used by the M1064 mortar carriers, which itself is based on the reputable M113s. The V-hull upgraded M1129 is known as the M1252 Stryker motor carrier. So anyway, Eric would be familiar with the 120mm GPS guided mortars like the APMI or Accelerated Precision Mortar Initiative cartridge, or the XM395 PGMM that replaces it. That's computer controlled and with GPS inputs to target can use directional fins for a precision strike for both all-weather LOS and NLOS, that's line of sight and non-line of sight, and can do short bursts or use base bleed tech for longer range by reducing drag on the shell. There's the HEGM, that's High Explosive Guided Mortar, and the Army's own GEFM, the Guided Enhanced Fragmentation Mortar. And so Short-Fuze would be familiar with all of these. In 2012, the U.S. Army was demonstrating the viability of 81mm mortar rounds equipped with roll-controlled fixed-wing canard systems and affixed to UAVs like the small Tiger Shark to deliver precision-guided mortars right on target, part of the Army's airdrop mortar program, which Eric might have been a part of. These all provide artillery and mortar specialists with more flexibility on the battlefield and reduce the need for ballistic calculations like velocity, angle of launch, time of flight, and range. Though, per his file cards, Short-Fuze can actually plot artillery azimuths and triangulations in his head. His love for abstract mathematics makes him somewhat of a nerd. However, no one would dare tease him. Eric is actually pretty sensitive about this, and if teased, tends to lose his temper, and this is how he earned his nickname, Short-Fuze. but his name outside of comic books spells fuse with a Z and not an S. Some, like the Ministry of Defense, make distinctions about this. Fuse with an S is sometimes used to denote a simple fuse, whereas fuse with a Z denotes a fuse that used a more complex ignition system, like proximity sensors, weight sensors, acoustics, and the like, versus something like a wick or black powder fuses that burn down to blasting caps or detonators. Eric then went to sapper school at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for 12 Bravo secondary MOS. There he learned things like bridge laying, minefield clearing and placement, building roadblocks and defenses, construction and destruction with basic demolitions, and even how to lay down an airfield in a hot zone. He was then the cutting edge of the country's sword. If you're not familiar with the word sapper, it's derived from sap, a French word meaning spade. Troops would do spade work in the form of digging covered trenches to the base of enemy walls at enemy forts so they could be destroyed. The trenches were called saps, and so the men digging them became known as sappers. So then, after all that training, Short-Fuze was then hand-picked for the new G.I. Joe team, chosen from, per his file cards, the top of his class. That's a little different from the story he tells in comics. In comic books, Short-Fuze went to Ranger School and was about to wash out when his trajectory changed. That part of his story is told in Larry Hama's G.I. Joe Declassified in 2006, shortly after he, Flash, and Steeler ran into Jody Shooter Craig for the first time. He was the one that pointed out that it was odd for a first chaplain's assistant to be wearing a CIB, though they thought he meant something else at first. Funny enough, it was Grand Slam who was recruited off the mortar range and not Short-Fuze. Short-Fuze went for a Ranger qualification, but Cadre figured he was a washout after Eric failed his psych exam due to losing his temper too much. During the E&E evolution of Ranger School, Eric was tied up and held, lasting longer through interrogation than anybody was ever supposed to. Most broke after 3 days, but Eric lasted 7 days, only giving his name and serial number that whole time. He knew he'd washed out though, and his superiors were just waiting for the next cycle period to ship him out, but as Eric says, he didn't want to give them the satisfaction. And yet that's how he came on the radar of a guy standing up a new rapid deployment force called G.I. Joe named Hawk. Hawk is quoted as saying, "In all my days, I've never seen a guy remember the information he does. Short-Fuze can plot artillery triangulations in his head faster than someone with a compass. He pinpoints targets with over 95% accuracy and provides the team with a huge advantage. The one thing you don't want to do around him is mock his gift of intelligence. The guy's temper flares up mighty quick, and everybody best stand back." In the very first issue of G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, for Operation Lady Doomsday, as the team was created to rescue Dr. Adele Burkhart, Eric shows up on the computer readout, which does spell his codename with an S and not a Z. For the mission, as part of Team Alpha, Short-Fuze was paired with Grunt and Stalker and tasked with taking out the airfield, tower, and hangar and leaving one craft intact for their escape off the island. As Hawk briefed the team on Burkhart, Eric chimed in, calling her a traitor, and so Hawk had to tell him to calm down. One of the few times that part of his profile was actually highlighted in story form. They made it to the airfield where Cobra had their MiG-21 fish beds and other aircraft parked. Curiously, Short-Fuze decided to conceal behind some drums of Exxon jet fuel of all places. He dropped rounds on the Cobra jets. Little did they know these planes were dummies, placed there as part of a larger ambush. Cobra knew they were coming. They then joined up with the main force to assault Cobra's stronghold and rescue Dr. Burkhart. Later, Short-Fuze, still using the S, was part of the inner ring of defense when the team was deployed to Kennedy's Space Center at Cape Canaveral to protect a shuttle launch. He was paired with Hawk, Zap, Snake Eyes, and Scarlet. Zap and Short-Fuze found cover in some tall grass and started lobbing ordnance at the Cobra sea legs and amphibian tanks that attacked the Cape from the sea. And later he provided suppressing fire, taking out a tower that had them pinned down so Hawk's team could advance. When the team went to Midtown Manhattan to neutralize a Cobra stronghold, Short-Fuze was part of the primary assault force, and they were to cover the street level from an electrical maintenance truck, while one team hit the roof and another team infiltrated through the sewer system. When things started to go sideways, Clutch drove the van through the front door, and the team attacked, with Eric having to use his rifle for close quarters combat, and they made it to the roof just to see it take off with the roof team trapped inside. In issue 11, when the team was up in the Alaskan tundra fighting Cobra's plot over an oil pipeline, Short-Fuze, Steeler, and Grand Slam were injured in the firefight, and so Doc had to give them some field dressings, and they were evac'd out for treatment. Then during the invasion of Washington, D.C., Short-Fuze was with Zap, Grunt, Flash, and Rock and Roll in the APC as they chased Cobra Commander in his tank right out of town with help from Ace in a Sky Striker. Then when Cobra was setting up to attack Fort Wadsworth to recover their agent, Short-Fuze helped Tripwire set up claymore mines under the ambulances parked outside the motor pool. In issue 22, after the base was destroyed, Short-Fuze was in the flooded computer bay with Flash working on repairs and made a cringy pun with his codename that Flash overanalyzed, making for a really awkward and yet funny interaction. action. Short-Fuze then went with Roadblock on a Coast Guard boat to Alcatraz with their captive Storm Shadow. In issue 33, General Austin came to the pit for a ceremony, and Short-Fuze was one of the Joes being promoted one pay grade and given a presidential citation that he could never share with anybody. During the Ripcord rescue mission, Short-Fuze was on the C-130 Hercules carrying the security team who had to work with the strike team to take down the airport and then secure all the roads leading out of the town of Springfield. For the invasion of Cobra Island during Cobra Commander's civil war with Serpentor, Short-Fuze was on the engineer team with Stalker, Tripwire, Mutt, and Junkyard, and responsible for EOD and demolitions. They inserted onto the island via the Whale, where they prepped their satchel charges to take out the ASP emplacements at the end of the airfield, which would then allow the transport planes to land and safely offload their cargo. And surprisingly, for being one of the original A Real American Hero Joes, that was the last time we hear from him again in Marvel's time on the title. In IDW Publishing's issue 255, Don Moreno was at Ranger School and impressing Colonel Park and Sergeant Masters enough that they remembered Eric's amazing feat years before. Most recently, Short-Fuze was part of another rescue mission to Springfield, this time to get Sean Collins out of the Springfield Community Center, where he was imprisoned by a CG named Laura 343 and Cobra. During the second volume of G.I. Joe, after the team was reinstated, Short-Fuze joined the battle on Cobra Island to fight back against Serpentor and his cult called the Coil. And then voiced by Frank Welker, Short-Fuze appeared in the original miniseries along with Revenge of Cobra. He also appeared in a few other episodes like The Funhouse, Ode Cobra, Spell of the Siren, The Traitor, but those were mostly silent appearances. His breakout issue was Battle for the Train of Gold, where we see Short-Fuze at Fort Knox and then chasing down a train laden with gold from horseback. Short-Fuze's first action figure was released in 1982, with a swivel arm hitting the pegs in 83. There were a few variations here with the handles on his mortar and the pegs on his backpack. These early versions were also put in offers and packs like the JCPenney 3-pack with Breaker and Zap, and both the Get Your Gear and Operation Freedom Has Begun mail-in offers. In 1997, Eric was included in the Stars and Stripes Forever box set. In 2004, Short-Fuze joined Night Force and was included in a Night Force set that was exclusive to Toys R Us that year. In 2005, Eric was put in a 3-pack with Rock and Roll and Flash, along with a comic book reprint. And the same year was in another Valor vs. Venom pack with Snake Eyes, Stalker, Frostbite, Backblast, and Mirage to conduct winter operations. Then in 2008, the Target exclusive Ultimate Battle Pack set included Short-Fuze and a plethora of other figures and vehicles. And finally, in late 2022, Gridiron Studios announced the 112 scale M224 Mortar Trooper loadout, which they say is great for G.I. Joe Classified. So where will Short-Fuze show up next? We'll have to wait and see, which means that's a wrap on this one, my friends. I'm Jesse, this is JLS Comics, and I'll see you soon.